Welcome back to Module 2, Rebuilding Ohio. Today we'll discuss the 1830s through the 1850s, focusing especially on the more subtle changes occurring in Ohio in the run-up to the Civil War. The problem under consideration is how Ohio, a crucial part of the pan-Mississippian world of the mid-19th century, actually rejected that world and turned its loyalty to the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, as late as the 1830s, no Ohioan identified with the term Northern or North to describe a united cultural or economic geographical region to which they belonged. And yet, during the Civil War, Ohio provided several of the Union's best generals and supplied over 300,000 soldiers, the third most of any state behind only Pennsylvania and New York. So clearly, by 1861, Ohioans considered themselves Northern. So what happened? If they didn't call themselves Northerners by the 1830s, then how did Ohioans refer to themselves? They would have recognized the term Yankees, meaning New Englanders, and Southerners, meaning someone from a slave state along the Atlantic coast, and Westerner. A Westerner was someone who lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. So, for example, both Kentuckians and Ohioans were Westerners. We don't quite think this way anymore, but before 1830, for whites anyway, the Ohio River was a common highway rather than a dividing line, which is its symbolic purpose today, separating the North and the South. Now keep in mind that New Orleans was the common destination for Westerners, whether they lived north or south of the Ohio River. So let's explore how that geographical identification changed, and we'll start with the emergence of public education in Ohio. Public education was the cause of a few people, a handful of well-connected middle and upper-class reformers who shared one criticism of Ohio. There were too many people from too many different places, but too few common values. So they lobbied the legislature to create a public school system that could socialize children. Their parents may all speak different languages, their parents may all have been born in separate countries, and they may all have different religions, but through school we can create a common value system in the children. So, in 1821, the General Assembly permitted local districts to raise taxes for the maintenance of schools. And in 1825, the legislature required people to pay property taxes to support those local schools. And in 1847, the legislature passed the Akron School Law, which established one district for Akron with a grade system, grade levels, and one central high school, an elected school board, and property taxes to pay for it all. And then in 1849, the legislature extended that Akron School Law to the rest of the state. And let's be clear about the underlying motive for establishing public schools: to mitigate the influence of immigrants by changing their children. Here's John Roberts, a public school teacher in the 1840s. Roberts worried that with the influx of foreigners, we also have to put up with a great deal of the refuse portion of Europe's population. The Irish are beginning to get discontented with the Americans, Roberts continued, and want to have all government in their hands, and the Catholics are getting to be very saucy. But at least the Irish weren't the Germans, because, according to Roberts, the Germans were perfect clodheads. What were these values that the reformers wanted to instill? A quick look at William Holmes McGuffey helps us figure that out. McGuffey was born in western Pennsylvania, but his family moved to the Youngstown area when McGuffey was still very young. As an adult, McGuffey served a variety of universities in Ohio, including Miami University as a professor and Ohio University as its president. He is most famous for publishing the McGuffey Reader, first issued in 1836 and then revised several times after that. By the mid-1800s, the McGuffey Reader was a standard textbook across the nation, and by 1890 it had sold more than 100 million copies. Here's what the book taught. It taught both reading skills and values. For example, life was serious business. He praised perseverance and hard work, and criticized laziness and gambling and purposelessness. Character was of the utmost importance, and character was exactly what your grandmother said it was. It's what you do when people aren't looking. Economic success to McGuffey was evidence of a person's good character. Most Ohioans believed that certain people were incapable of learning those lessons, so it was illegal for blacks to attend public schools in Ohio until the 1840s. It was then, in 1848, that the General Assembly finally created separate black schools paid for by the taxes of black parents. And then Cleveland abolished those separate schools in the 1850s, integrating the system, as did several other school districts in northern Ohio. But in Cincinnati, the separate schools persisted. Still, by 1860, only 38% of all black children attended school, compared to 72% of white children. And what of the immigrant parents whose children were the targets of reformers? Immigrant parents understood that public schools were conceived, built, and controlled by native-born white Protestants. And reformers believed that civic identity as an Ohioan and as an American was far more important than any identification with religion or ethnic nationality. So immigrant parents often withdrew their children from public schools and created their own school system, one usually attached to a Catholic school, to teach the values that they believed in, often in a language that they spoke. So, for example, just south of downtown Columbus is German Village. On 3rd Street, you can find the St. Mary Church, built by German immigrants, and a school, St. Mary's School, next door to the church. Why, immigrant parents asked, should we give up our traditional ways? So yes, there were limits to public education. It could not change everyone, if only because some people weren't allowed to participate and others chose not to participate. My point is about the construction of the public school system and the design of its curriculum. These things demonstrate for us what a growing number of Ohioans wanted to think about themselves. The school system and its curriculum represented the aspirations of Ohioans, and when they compared themselves to others, especially other Westerners, Ohioans increasingly saw themselves as different. What they weren't helped them to think about what they were. And for most Ohioans, immigrant or not, black or not, the most obvious thing that they weren't was slaveholders. Let's turn again to the words of Alexis de Tocqueville. Recall that he was a French aristocrat who traveled the United States in the late 1820s and the 1830s. As he traveled through Ohio, chugging down the river on a steamboat, he observed that the river was a border that divided two distinct regions. On the southern side of the border, de Tocqueville found Kentucky. He characterized it as a sparsely populated place, having few cities or towns. He also argued that Kentuckians devalued work because labor was connected to the idea of slavery. Who worked the hardest? Slaves did. And idleness marked a person of status. So to be white, fully white, one had to be idle, or lazy, in the words of William Holmes McGuffey. And cupidity, or greed if you recall, required only that you consume things, that you buy things with money you didn't personally earn. On the northern side of the border, de Tocqueville found Ohio, and he heard there a confused hum. He heard people busy at work, slaughtering pigs, rolling steel, digging coal and cutting down forests, building communities and inventing useful things. He heard the sounds of industrial urban society. And labor there was honorable, associated with progress. Status was earned through hard work. And the people on the northern side of the border were rich and contented because they could profit from their hard work, whereas the people who worked the hardest in Kentucky were slaves, and they couldn't profit at all from their labor. And the northern side had cupidity as well. But to be greedy, to accumulate things, you needed to be creative, you needed to persevere, you needed to have the kind of character that William Holmes McGuffey suggested you needed in order to be successful. I'm not saying that de Tocqueville was correct. I'm saying that Ohioans wanted to believe that he was correct. A pervasive trope, or commonly used theme or device deployed to explain something, this imagined contrast between Ohio and Kentucky went to the heart of an emerging and increasingly influential popular image of Ohio. Kentucky, let's face facts, made Ohio look good. And Ohioans, especially middle-class Ohioans, thought that their material progress was directly related to their superior moral progress. The ban on slavery, mandated by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, had made all the difference. Or at least that's what Ohioans wanted to believe. And this trope was put to its most dramatic and effective use in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which one character, the young slave Eliza, escaped across the Ohio River from Kentucky in the dead of winter, jumping from ice floe to ice floe, with the slave posse and their dogs hard on her heels. Slavery stopped progress, Ohioans began to believe, and freedom created progress. This idea was new to Ohioans, and it was a direct assault on the pan-Mississippian world that Cincinnatians had helped to create, a world of technological progress, of prosperity, and of slavery. You can see de Tocqueville's observation come to life in this painting by Robert S. Duncanson. Duncanson was born in upstate New York in the early 1800s. His mother was an African American from Cincinnati, and his father was of African and European descent and was from Virginia. In his youth, Duncanson and his family moved to Monroe, Michigan, on Lake Erie in between Toledo and Detroit. He was largely a self-taught painter, yet was once called the best landscape painter in the West. In the 1840s, Duncanson moved to Mount Healthy, Ohio, just north of Cincinnati. Then it served as a center of culture and of abolition activity among free blacks. Earlier, in the 1830s, it had been an escape route, a place where rich people could escape the cholera epidemic. In fact, its name had once been Mount Pleasant, but town residents changed the name to Mount Healthy once its value was proven during the epidemic. Duncanson was also the first African-American painter to take the grand tour of Europe, showing his painting to European audiences. So think about this painting, note its name and date, and ask yourself a series of questions. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? No, the painting isn't interactive. Imagine what you see, what you hear, and what you smell. And ask yourself, what is this painter's view of the Ohio River, of Cincinnati, and of Kentucky? As you think about this painting, we'll wrap up today's lecture. During the 1830s, Ohioans slowly began to change their minds about who they were. Increasingly, that meant rejecting the pan-Mississippian world that they had done so much to create. It meant imagining the Ohio River in a new way, as a border between two groups of white people. On one side of the border, there was a morally superior civilization, valuing hard work and freedom. On the other side of the border was a degraded and backward people, a morally inferior people because of the presence of slavery. To make this new attitude work, Ohioans had to refocus their state to the east, across the Appalachians. But that's the subject of our next lecture.